Let's turn to a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism. My name is Ariel ben-Lyman, HaNaviy. Let's take these 30 minutes and look at this topic, which is apologetic in nature. It is taking Trinitarian-leaning verses and defending them against the attacker known as biblical Unitarianism. So, what does biblical Unitarian believe? Well, we'll get to that in a moment, but what I'm working from is biblicalunitarian.com, and they're going to be presenting their position of Micah 5 verse 2, I believe it is. And in that passage, they're going to take the position that Jesus is not this eternal, pre-existent being that existed from way back in time and is now being prophesied to come onto Israel's scene. What they do is they work from the hermeneutic principle that I've highlighted on the screen, which is that there are numerous verses in the Bible that explain the nature of God and the nature of His Son. They say it this way: the following are clear explanations of the verses in the Bible that Trinitarians have sometimes used in attempts to quote-unquote prove the Trinity and to substantiate that Jesus is God. Since there are an overwhelming number of clear verses about Jesus Christ's identity and His distinction from God, and since God's Word has no contradictions, these comparatively few verses must fit with the many clear verses, and in their opinion, they absolutely do. So that's their hermeneutic that they're working from. What does biblicalunitarian.com believe? I've created this short little summary file to explain their belief. I've explained their beliefs in previous studies, and also when it comes to their position on Micah 5:2, which I'm going to show you in a moment, I've explained that, and I've read it and detailed it in previous studies. You have to go to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/Tetze Torah Ministries and look at or if you're watching this video, just click on the little thumbnail that shows my icon of my YouTube channel and look at the series of teachings that are being followed in this particular set on Micah 5:2. Go back to video number 1 of the Micah commentary, which isn't very far back. It's only about we're only on part 4 or 5 or something like that, 6 or 7, not very far in yet. So go back to part 1 and I'll explain. I've had people write into me and say, Ariel, how come you're not explaining biblical Unitarian's position? You're jumping right into your position. We want to know what they believe first. I explained theirs already, right? I'm trying to shorten the studies instead of reading theirs over and over again. But here's what they believe as far as Trinitarian topics and discussions. BiblicalUnitarian.com presents the Father as the sole true God, the Son as the human Messiah distinct from God, and the Holy Spirit is either another name for God the Father or the divine power bestowed upon believers. That's basically the way they view the three topics that we Trinitarians call Trinity. Okay, so here's the verse in question, read from the NIV version of BiblicalUnitarian.com's website, Micah 5:2. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you're small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from ancient times. Everything really kind of rises or falls on the final sentence, the final clause, whose origins are from ancient times, right? This ruler of Israel. What does it mean that his origins are from ancient times? I decided I'd let Copilot, which is built into Edge browser, you can see on my screen here. I thought I'd let them explain this for a moment. Let me see if I can blow up just that part. Nope, it blew it up for me, but not for you guys in YouTube land. Well, actually, man, maybe it did blow up in YouTube land, but maybe just not for you guys in Skype land. So let me blow that up again. What they say is, what I'm doing is I'm showing you Skype's explanation, a summary basically of what Biblical Unitarian believes. The interpretation of Micah 5:2. Oops, let's get some more of that. There we go. The interpretation of Micah 5:2. This is what Copilot has to say. For those of you who are in my Skype class, look over to the right side of the screen. It still looks small to you, but on my screen, trust me, it looks big, which means it's blown up on my screen recorder for my YouTube people. The interpretation of Micah 5:2. The verse is often interpreted by some Trinitarians as evidence for the eternal preexistence of Jesus. However, the article argues that the terms used in Micah 5:2 do not point to eternality, but rather to Israel's historical past and God's promises to David. So there is your explanation of what Biblical Unitarian believes. Now let's jump right into my refutation. We only scratched the surface of this 2 weeks ago before we went into our Purim break. So I've just backed up into the beginning heading of what I'm calling my brief exegesis of Micah 5:2 in the Hebrew Tanakh and its Christological significance. This is part of a larger essay that I've already discussed different standard Christian Trinitarian perspectives from three very well-known and well-trusted doctors of theology, Dr. Michael Heiser, Dr. Michael Brown, Dr. James White, and then a pastor, Pastor John Piper. So I called that section 3 docs and a pastor. So we already went through all that. Now we're into looking at my own brief foray into the Hebrew and its Christological significance. We started into this 2 weeks ago, but I'll pick it up again. So we got Micah 5:2, which reads as follows in the Hebrew. And the reason I'm bringing the Hebrew in this point in time is because Biblical Unitarian makes it one of their main points to highlight the Hebrew of the last clause, which is going to be that part right there. But the entire Hebrew verse reads, Va'ata Beit Lachem, I'm sorry, let's start, Va'ata Beit Lachem Ephrata Ze'ir Lichot Ba'alfei Yehuda Mimcha Liyetze Lichot Moshel B'Yisrael. And now this final clause, the one that I just highlighted for you in blue, Umotza Otaiv Mikedem Mimei Olam. So what we're going to do is we're going to highlight, basically we're going to talk about this phrase, which I've highlighted for you in blue right now, Umotza Otaiv. Then we're going to look at Mimei, and we're going to look at Olam. Mikedem, we're going to look at that very briefly, but that's not the focus, because Biblical Unitarian didn't highlight it as well. But let's first jump into a translation. This is the over 100-year-old 1917 Jewish Publication Society, that's JPS, translation of this particular verse, which reads similar to a KJV translation. It's got the Old English in it. It reads, quote, But thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, which art little to be among the thousands of Judah, out of thee shall come forth unto me, and the me is capitalized because it's God speaking, that is to be the ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from ancient days. Okay, so the question really, again, is centered around this particular ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from ancient days. Either A, it's referring to David or a progeny of David who would come onto the scene later on. So it's connected to not just one of David's sons who would sit on the throne, right, following after his father King David. So this would make him a rightful ruler, a king. It's either one of these guys, Hezekiah or something like that, or B, it's one of these guys who's really, really old, right? A time traveler, guy who shows up in Israel's scene, but when he shows up in Israel, he's going to say, hey, guess what? I've been around for hundreds or thousands of years. Maybe not from eternity, but from old, right? From ancient days. I'm a pretty old guy, but I'm a time traveler. That's one possibility. Obviously, that's a nonsense possibility. No one's really kind of going along with that. Or the Christian Trinitarian position is that it's Jesus, but Jesus predates his own birth in Bethlehem. Biblical Trinitarians are Christians. They do believe this is Jesus, but they just are like, well, the goings forth from old and from ancient days is a reference either to promises made to David or the prophecy that goes back into David's lineage or something like that. So it's not really the person who's from old. The word goings there, the Mikedem part, the Umotzo Taiv part, is a reference, they say, to his reputation, the promise, something like that. All right, let's read my own exegesis, because we didn't get very far into this 2 weeks ago. Exegesis of key words and phrases. The Biblical Unitarian argument, let me do my little highlight thing. The Biblical Unitarian argument centers around 3 Hebrew phrases, so allow me to isolate each of them phrase by phrase for a moment, and this is where they're going to get their most mileage. Number 1, Motza Otaiv, translated as his origins or his goings forth. Number 2, Mikedem, translated as from before or from long ago. And number 3, mime olam, translated as from eternity or from ancient days. So this is where a biblical Unitarian tries to convince us that these phrases are not an expression of eternality. Let's see what I have to say about that. The biblical Unitarian view argues that these 3 key terms point to Israel's historical past, not eternity. However, from a Trinitarian perspective, these phrases are indeed indicative of the Messiah's preexistence and eternal nature. I'm not really refuting, I'm not really providing any form of explanation of the passage so much as I'm just refuting them right now. I'm only providing an assertion, not really a refutation. However, what I do go on to say is, let's reincorporate these 3 phrases back into the verse as a whole, provide a short summary interpretation, and then we'll continue to examine the wider context. I'm going a bit quickly because this is kind of review. Okay, so I have the first phrase. We have Motza otai mikedem mime olam, which I translated as whose origin is from old, from ancient days. So the phrase mime olam, so I'm skipping over that part for a moment. This phrase, mime olam, from ancient days, is significant. I go on to say that the term olam refers to eternity. Now I'm beginning to provide a bit of refutation, okay? I'm moving from assertion to refutation. The term, the phrase mime olam, from ancient days, contains the term olam. And this term olam does refer to eternity or ancient times, but it's only from context. Its use in the Tanakh often carries the connotation of something beyond the temporal, sometimes implying an eternal existence. So context does demand if it's referring to just a long time ago or if it's referring to eternity. Look at this quote from inclusion of Psalm 90 verse 2. I updated this from last time. Last time it didn't have the Hebrew in there, but I put it in this time. Psalm 90 verse 2 reads, quote, "Before the mountains were born, or you gave birth to the earth and the world." And then notice the underlined clause, "even from everlasting to everlasting," which in Hebrew would be umeolam ad olam. So even from everlasting to everlasting, and then the verse concludes by saying, "You are God." Now, I realize I've jumped out of the context of Micah to look at another verse that uses the same wording as Micah. And therefore, what I'm not saying is that just because the book of Psalms uses the word olam in the context of eternity, because clearly the context is God Almighty, I'm not saying that that automatically means that Micah's use of the same Hebrew term olam must mean eternity as well. I'm not saying that. That would be cherry picking and committing a fallacy of conflating the same Hebrew word across multiple passages, which is something we don't want to do. We don't want to cherry pick, and we don't want to take a word that's in passage A and automatically assign that meaning to passage B just because it's the same Hebrew word. Many Bible students do make this mistake. Don't make that mistake. Each word has its own context, and there could be a range of meanings, a nuance, kind of like a meta-narrative that's created by the different words or similar words in different passages by different authors across different eras that are being used in slightly different ways. So I'm aware of that. However, what I do go on to say is, and again, this is review, so I'm not going to get too pointed at this point. This phrase here, when we talk about olam, this points to God's eternal nature, emphasizing that he is not bound by time. And so when Micah describes the ruler from Bethlehem as having origins from of old, right, the olam part, mime olam, it strongly suggests a timeless pre-existent figure. It's not a slam dunk. Right? I can't say definitely because olam means eternity in Psalms that, it must mean it means it in Micah. No, I'm not going to fall for that trap either. But it does strongly suggest a timeless pre-existent figure, which fits with Trinitarian Christology, where the second person of the Trinity, the Son, is understood as eternally pre-existent before his incarnation. So it means that there's a possibility that Micah could have mean this. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because sometimes I hear non-Trinitarians say there is no way that the Old Testament could have been hinting at Jesus being eternally existent, or it's just impossible. They discount it altogether. And I'm saying, we do have the possibility, because within this particular word, which does show up in Micah, we have a possible nuance, because the word does show up elsewhere, and in other verses, it clearly means eternally. So that creates the possibility. I'm not saying it's a slam dunk, but again, you have to work with what you've got. And so both of us are in the position where we've got to realize that, yes, it flips the other way as well. They could say, well, just like it's possible that it means eternally, maybe it's also possible it just means a really old guy, or a guy whose promises go really back in far in time. Yeah, I recognize that as well, but follow with me, okay? Let's keep going to the one of the other Hebrew words that's in the promise in Micah 5:2, ruler, which is moshel. The term moshel, ruler or dominion, indicates one who has authority and power. I go on to say that this is a kingly figure, and the use of the term strengthens the messianic expectations associated with this passage. Again, we're talking about Micah 5:2, which Biblical Unitarian says does not refer to an eternal Messiah, but unlike Rabbinic Judaism, and this is a very important unlike that I want you to catch in case you didn't know, Biblical Unitarian who's non-Trinitarian, they do hold that this passage is speaking of Jesus, which separates Biblical Unitarian from Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism just throws this out altogether, right? No, that's not Jesus. That can't be him. It's some other character. But Biblical Unitarians embraces the fact that this is Jesus, which I applaud. All right, so I go on to say that a ruler coming from Bethlehem points to a Davidic lineage, but the claim that his origin is from old, quote-unquote, distinguishes this ruler from all other earthly kings, implying a divine nature. So I think that, again, this gives us room as Trinitarians to begin to build our interpretation that this is referring to Jesus himself. It is not in isolating the verse from other verses, in other words, cherry picking, that we say, boom, we got it. Slam dunk, case closed. Jesus is this ruler. Jesus is the Moshel. Jesus is this one who's from eternity, right? It doesn't work that way. Rather, this is what is part of, and I mentioned this a few weeks ago, it's what we should understand as a meta-narrative, a larger picture created by the Bible as a whole. When we take verses strewn across the landscape of the Bible in different books written by different authors in different eras, but when we get to the time period when Jesus hit the scene, revealed himself as who he was, and then we got the apostolic writers, the apostolic scriptures writing and recording what Jesus said, all of this under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, we end up with this giant composite, what I called last week a case file, that's built of individual little pieces that have now been researched and brought all back together so that we can see who this person is. We can build what we might call, in kind of criminal terminology, our profile of this individual, who Jesus is, right? And we're not saying he's a criminal, but it's similar to what police officers or investigators do, or some private detectives or whatever. They build all these clues based on different pieces of evidence that they found at the crime scene here and there, and they're chasing after who might be the killer, and they're creating a case file on what they believe who the identity of the killer is, and then they finally don't realize who the identity is until they get that final last clue. Well, we're building our case file of this the identity of this person known as Messiah based on all these clues that are strewn throughout the Bible, and Micah 5:2 is just one of those clues. So we are absolutely not cherry picking, okay? We Trinitarians. Let's keep going. For Trinitarian Christology, this is significant, right? Talking about this ruler whose origins are from old. This is significant because it suggests that the Messiah is not merely a human descendant of David, but one whose authority transcends earthly kingship. Again, I'm not saying this is a slam dunk. I'm simply saying that it gives us the license and the warrant for making the claims that we make. It would be different if we were, to be absurd. What if I was claiming that Jesus was a woman? right? As absurd as that sounds. I've heard some people say that, God is a woman, or God is genderless, God is an it. What if I were to get, I think there's like a gender neutral Bible out there, or some nonsense Bible. Absolutely blasphemous. And it would be a blasphemous thing to say that the Messiah was a woman. I don't have anything against women, but I'm trying to bring up a point. What if I were to say that Jesus was a woman? Right? What if this were the claim that I was making as a Christian? Jesus is a woman. Well, right away you'd have to stop and say, okay, Ariel, Jesus is a woman. But what do you have any verse that supports that claim? And I'd turn to some of these like the Gospel of Thomas, or all these the Syllabine oracles, or this esoteric writing that I found that somebody found in an ancient cave that was buried for 2,000 years, that was finally unearthed, and it's the lost gospel. This says that Jesus is a woman, or some goofy thing like that. The point is that everyone would be like, excuse me, everyone would be like automatically, there's just no way that could be true, because there's no biblical passages that would even lend any credence to that claim. Well, that's the point I'm trying to bring up, is that it's not like we Trinitarians are coming out from left field like with some claim that absolutely can't be supported by any biblical verse. On the other hand, when the biblical Unitarians come along and say Jesus is a man, we Trinitarians say, yes, we agree. And, right? We do agree he's a man, because there are numerous verses that explain that Jesus is a man. The point that we say to them is that it's not that you're using verses out of context, it's that you're not following through with the remainder of the profile. Keep reading the rest of the story. Keep reading the rest of the Bible, and you'll see that Jesus is not merely man. All right, let's keep going. Now we got Bethlehem Ephratah, right? Bethlehem Ephratah. The location, Bethlehem, is emphasized here in this part of the prophecy, I say, as being, quote, too little to be among the clans of Judah. This is what the verse reads. Despite its insignificance and size, it will be the birthplace of the great ruler. Later on, we're going to see that Pastor Piper does a great job of explaining, of giving us something that is a highlight for this particular, what he believes is something that highlights why perhaps God chose Bethlehem as the birthplace for the Messiah. This aligns with the humble nature. No, I think I'm doing it right here. This aligns, I say, but I think I got this from Piper, so I can't claim ownership of it. I didn't come up with this idea, but I agree with it. This interpretation of, or implication, I believe, that, in other words, we're asking, why, God, did you choose Bethlehem? Why not choose, Jerusalem itself? Why not choose some great, magnificent city and bring Messiah in with all kinds of fanfare and big announcements? You brought him in on the backward side of Israel, in this really tiny little place where no one's ever gonna look for him. But let's keep reading. This aligns, I say, with the humble nature of the Messiah's incarnation as emphasized in the Gospels. And so I go on to say that the term Ephratah ties the town to the historical context of the Davidic line, as this is the same Bethlehem where David was born, right? If we read 1 Samuel 16:1, I believe that Ephratah, if I remember, is a name for the town. Wait, I suppose I could look it up here real quick. Give me a moment. Let's just pull up. I should have had this earlier. 1 Samuel 16:1, just to make sure. All right. And so Samuel goes to Bethlehem. Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long are you going to mourn for Saul, since I've rejected him from being king of Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse. Who's Jesse? Jesse is the father of David. Jesse the Bethlehemite, because I have chosen a king for myself among his sons. Okay, it didn't say anything about Ephrathah, but I apologize. I'll look it up later and find out why I made particular mention there. But let's keep going in my essay here. This smallness, the fact that he's born in a very insignificant town, it contrasts with the greatness of the ruler prophesied, right? If you notice, he's this ruler from this very small town, but he's going to be the ruler over Israel. That's my point, the contrast. It contrasts with the greatness of the ruler prophesied, foreshadowing the paradoxical nature of the Messiah's first coming, where he is both humble and divine. All right, let's see. I have got 5 minutes. I'm going to keep plugging along if you guys are okay with that. Key points of theological significance for Trinitarian Christology. Number 1, preexistence of the Messiah. The phrase from old, mime olam, directly supports the concept of the preexistence of the Messiah. Remember, I mentioned this earlier. It's not a slam dunk argument, but because of the nuance of the word olam, which in some verses is eternity, it's not saying that the verse here absolutely cannot be eternity. Right? That's my point. It could be. But either way, this concept of eternity directly supports the concept of a preexistence of the Messiah, a core tenet of Trinitarian doctrine. And that's the point I'm trying to bring out. The Messiah, I go on to say, as the second person of the Trinity, existed with the Father and the Holy Spirit before creation. Right? Compare from John 1 through 3. And then I already talked about this particular psalm, but I'm highlighting it again because we're in a different section. Psalm 90 verse 2 clearly states that God is eternal, and the use of the same phrase in Micah connects the eternal existence of the Messiah to the eternal God. Is that a slam dunk argument? No. But yes, it means that this could be, and I believe it is, hinting at the fact that Jesus is this eternal Messiah. Remember, I'm getting my Trinitarian theology not just from the experiential Trinitarian records that were recorded by the experiential Trinitarians that the disciples became once they encountered the Lord himself and wrote about what he did, right? In other words, what turned into what we now call the New Testament, what I call the Apostolic Scriptures. I'm not just getting it from that, but I'm also realizing the fact that God, from times past, hid the incarnation of his Son from the Old Testament writers and readers, only to be revealed later on. But it's important for us to acknowledge that hidden revelation is not the same as non-existent revelation. And thus we end up with this phrase, mystery. I am a proud Mysterian theologian. I am a Mysterian theologian. What does that mean? It means I believe that God hid truths in the Old Testament only to reveal them in the New Testament, even though some of them are still mysterious. But they were present. And this means that Jesus didn't just suddenly become this God-man of the New Testament in the incarnation. He didn't just become God from the New Testament era. Rather, the Old Testament always had him as very God, veiled in flesh, and he just showed up as in theophanies and Christophanies, angel of the Lord, captain of the Lord's host, things like that. Three men showing up outside of Abraham's tent, and one of them is Yahweh. That type of thing. We had Jesus showing up in his pre-incarnate form, but we didn't know him as Messiah back then. God knew, but we didn't know, right? The angel of the Lord is God, but is a separate representation of God, a figure of God, not a manifest, not a, what was I going to say? I was going to say a mode of God. It's not a mode of God. The angel of the Lord is actually a separate person, a personage, a figure, and yet it's the messenger of God and is very God. I mean, it's a mystery. That's why I say I can't explain it. So, looking at Psalm 92, we have warrant for that. Number 2, divine and human nature. This is how we Trinitarians explain this incarnation reality, this hypostatic nature, the fact that Jesus can be very God and yet be truly human at the same time. He's both divine and human. The contrast between the smallness of Bethlehem and the great ruler who will come from there reflects the dual nature of the Messiah, fully divine, fully human, right? The hypostatic union. His divine nature is hinted at by the eternal origins, while its humanity is reflected in his birth in a humble town. Again, I got that those statements basically from Pastor John Piper. And then I think I'll read this last point, number 3, and then we'll draw our study to a close. Number 3, Messiah's eternal kingship. The term ruler that I mentioned earlier, Moshael, in Micah 5:2 suggests the Messiah's eternal kingship as his dominion is not limited by time or space. This connects to the New Testament understanding of Christ's reign, where he is described as reigning eternally, right? Luke 1:33, Revelation 11:15, which is consistent with the Trinitarian view of Christ's divine kingship. So the numbers basically are functioning under the key points. It's kind of like a summary, The key points of the theological significance for Trinitarian Christology are: number one, the preexistence of the Messiah; number two, his divine and human nature; and number three, his eternal kingship. And that's why I'm using the words that are found in the Micah 5:2 passage to bolster my argument. So we're going to leave off here. We'll pick up next week. There are some additional, well, you know what? Let me read this last thing. Some additional Tanakh references. I've got about another 60 seconds left, and I don't want to break it off here because I've got a full section break coming up next. In Isaiah 9:6-7, in this passage, the Messiah is described as, quote, the everlasting Father, right? The Avi Ad from the Hebrew. And I say as a Trinitarian that this suggests a divine eternal nature. And this helps you to see that I'm not cherry picking. This helps you to see that this idea that we Trinitarians describe Jesus as a divine figure is not only rooted in Micah 5:2. Rather, it's what I mentioned earlier. It's found in other passages of the Tanakh, but it was hidden from the writer's perspective. It was hidden from the reader's perspective. It was hidden in mystery until God chose to reveal this truth of incarnation in the time period of the apostolic scriptures. So when we go back to passages like Isaiah 9, which we've looked at on this particular YouTube channel, we can see that there are suggestions of the Messiah's eternal nature here. The fact that he's called the everlasting Father. This is not to be confusing the Son with the Father. I'm not saying the Son is the Father by using Isaiah 9:6. I can hear the objectors, my detractors, typing away on their keyboards right now, right? Clack, 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 tick, 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 tick. No, I am not, as a Trinitarian, saying that the Son is the Father. I'm not confusing the Avi Ad of Isaiah with the Son, who Jesus is. Rather, without getting too deep into it, suffice to say, the everlasting Father here in Isaiah is referring to the King of Israel being viewed as the Father of the nation of Israel. And so the Father of eternity, the everlasting Father, the Avi Ad, is this Father who will be the Father to the nation of Israel. King David was seen as a father. If you guys want support verses for that or rabbinic quotes that kind of bring this concept in, bring this out, the one I'm describing right now, I'm not going to do it right now, but if you write in or you post a comment below, if you watch the video, like, all right, I want to see support for that. Where you're getting that, Ariel, that the Messiah is supposed to be the Father of the nation of Israel. I'll provide that later on, but that's what's going on here. It's not to confuse the Son with the Father. We're not pulling some oneness Pentecostal trick where we're saying that the Son is the Father. Not doing that. All right, so I continue. But this verse and the theology of the verse aligns with the eternal origin of the ruler in Micah 5:2. And then we've got another passage that we have looked at on this YouTube channel as well, and I'll close with this. Proverbs 8:22 and 23. In describing wisdom, the passage states, quote, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. From everlasting I was established, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. Notice that the language in Proverbs is quite explicit, and it does not allow for some excuse that the figure spoken of in Proverbs is simply a really old guy. You know what I'm talking about? Like the objectors, those who object to me turning the figure in Micah 5:2 into an eternal guy instead of just a really old guy, or a promise going back to David from a long time ago, like biblical Unitarian objects. Right? So you got the people who object to Trinitarian theology by saying, well, every time it says olam doesn't mean it's eternity. It could just mean really old people, or a promise going really far back into Israel's history, or something to that effect. But when you get to the book of Proverbs, if you look at the language, I don't see how there's a way that we can say that the figure or the focal point of the writer of the Proverbs here is referring to just some really old person. The language there doesn't seem to allow for that. The elaboration of, before his works of old, from everlasting, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. It's like he's trying to emphasize that whatever he's talking about goes all the way back to before there was any creation. And whatever he's talking about here coexists with very God, right? The Lord, that's the tetragrammaton name of Yahweh there. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way. And so we've talked about the fact that numerous Christian authors have gone on to to believe that this figure in the book of Proverbs here is none other than Jesus himself, the Word who became flesh in John 1:1. So we've done a study on Proverbs on this particular YouTube channel, so go check it out. But I go on to say that this also echoes the eternal preexistence of the Messiah, who's identified as the divine Word in the New Testament. And there it is, John 1:1. Okay, so we're going to stop there for tonight. Next week, we'll start to turn to some more exegesis. But this time, we're going to do it in the form of exegesis of Micah 5:2 in the Greek Septuagint, the LXX, and its Christological significance. So you want to catch that next week. But in the meantime, while you're waiting, don't forget to watch this video. Go back and watch previous studies, the ones that you missed over the 2-week break or whatever, or the Purim break. Go back and get caught up on where we're going in this particular study, so that you're able to follow along with the future studies that I'm putting together. But that'll do it for a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism.